On 2 November 1944, above the Leuna synthetic oil plant near Merseburg, the 8th Air Force dispatched about 680 B-17 heavy bombers, escorted by about 640 P-51 and P-38 fighters. German day fighter units in the sector put up roughly 40 serviceable Bf-109 and Fw-190 fighters into the freezing sky to intercept. Range of the P-51 escort reached 1,600 miles at 25,000 feet with drop tanks. The German leader climbed through scattered flak turned southeast, and at 24,000 feet saw contrails stretch 60 miles without break. Several combat wings of B-17 bombers flew in staggered boxes, while P-51 fighters orbited 3,000 feet higher at 40 miles per hour faster. He pushed throttle to emergency power and led the group astern into the stream. Tracers reached out before the bombers filled his sight. 2 Staffeln scattered under Mustang attack, while their commander pressed alone through an entire combat box. About 680 bombers faced roughly 40 fighters. He fired saw strikes, then felt his own aircraft shudder and trail glycol. Many comrades failed to return. German pilots looked down the endless column and understood courage could no longer change arithmetic. American heavy bomber strength in England grew from 12 B-17 aircraft in August 1942 to more than 900 serviceable heavy bombers by October 1944. 8th Air Force commanders accepted a sustainable loss rate of around 4% per mission to maintain constant pressure on selected target systems. Major synthetic oil plants such as Leuna and Ruland together supplied the majority of German aviation fuel and many critical lubricants during 1944. Repeated raids dropping thousands of tons of bombs cut Leuna output to a fraction of its capacity for extended periods. Luftflotte Reich carried well over 1,900 single-engine fighters on paper strength, yet only a few hundred aircraft stood serviceable on an average autumn day in 1944. Fuel allocations to flying units fell sharply through 1944 as synthetic production declined under attack. New pilot training hours fell steeply between 1942 and 1944 for fighter replacements. Experienced formation leaders became irreplaceable once lost, and incoming pilots often arrived with few or no operational sorties total. American escort range extended month by month until P-47, and later P-51 units could cover deep penetrations into central Germany by mid to late 1944. German early warning radar remained dense along the entire western frontier, but controllers could no longer assemble large fighter concentrations because too few aircraft answered the call. Every mission that penetrated central Germany now struck key targets repeatedly, or pushed into regions earlier reached less often in the war. Unescorted bombers once turned back at 30,000 feet, sealing over the Ruhr long-range escorts removed that barrier entirely. German war industry required uninterrupted oil flow measured in thousands of tons daily. American planners required only consistent monthly reduction, measured in percentage points, until plants fell below critical thresholds. Both sides recognized that once escort fighters accompanied bombers to every major industrial target, the Luftwaffe possessed weeks rather than months as an effective force. Oil campaign results compounded weekly. Each plant taken offline for repair forced greater strain on the remaining facilities. By November 1944, the Reich faced the prospect of fighter units grounded for lack of aviation spirit, while American bombers returned to the same targets, escorted the entire distance. The arithmetic of industrial war had replaced the earlier arithmetic of individual combat skill. 8th Air Force dispatched about 1,170 heavy bombers on 2 November 1944, supported by about 970 long-range fighters flying continuous relay escort from English bases to the heart of Germany and back. Each combat wing assembled 54 heavy bombers in 3 18-aircraft boxes, staggered in trail, flying at 220 miles per hour, indicated airspeed, while maintaining precise station to concentrate defensive fire. Escort groups rotated coverage every 40 minutes, handing the stream from one fighter group to the next so that bombers never flew more than 20 miles without top cover. American planners regarded the loss of a few dozen bombers per 1,000 sorties as tolerable when the target system comprised a limited set of critical plants. German single-engine day fighter inventory declined from several thousand aircraft in June 1944 to roughly half that number by November, with daily serviceability often averaging below 30%. Sortie rate per assigned fighter fell markedly across Luftflotte Reich in the final quarter because ground crews lacked spare parts and high-octane fuel. Many new German pilots received only limited hours total on the Bf 109 before posting to combat units, whereas American fighter pilots typically completed far higher totals of flying time before their first escort mission. Hard combat use shortened effective engine life and increased maintenance demands on both sides. German interceptors rarely assembled more than 60 aircraft against any single bomber stream once escort screens engaged 20 to 40 miles ahead of the heavies. P-51 pilots flying at 28,000 feet held 3,000-foot altitude advantage and 40-mile-per-hour speed advantage over climbing Bf 109 aircraft. American defensive gunners and escort pilots together claimed well over 100 German fighters destroyed on 2 November across all engagements, while actual German day fighter losses for that date amounted to several dozen aircraft and pilots. Overclaiming arose from multiple fighters firing at the same damaged bomber and from smoke obscuring final outcomes in crowded sky. Each large mission repeated the same pattern, once drop tanks extended P-51 radius to deep targets across Germany. German fighters expended full ammunition in passes, lasting 12 to 18 seconds before escort pressure forced disengagement. Fuel remaining after sustained combat was often low by the time German fighters broke away to return to base. American bombers returned to the same plants week after week, accepting limited daily losses to achieve cumulative destruction measured in months rather than individual missions. The constraint was the strain such continuous operations placed on pilots' engines and maintenance systems on both sides. Heinz Knoke rose before dawn on 2 November 1944 at Acme Dispersal and walked across frozen grass to his Bf 109. Ground crew had prepared the fighter with full fuel and ammunition for a high-altitude interception. Knoke started the Daimler-Benz 605 engine in the freezing dark and watched oil temperature climb before taxiing to the runway. Fighters of 1st Gruppe Jagdgeschwader 11 formed up in loose pairs and lifted off into darkness. Oxygen masks iced at high altitude, while the Gruppe climbed to gain height before turning southeast toward the reported stream. Controllers ordered maximum continuous power to bring the formation up to the level of the approaching bombers. At altitude, the bomber stream appeared as a black line across the morning haze south of Hanover contrails, merging into a solid white roof. P-51 escorts detached from high cover and dived through the German formation. Knoke saw a comrade aircraft disintegrate under concentrated 50 caliber fire before the bombers grew large in his reflector sight. He closed to short range on a B-17 in the leading group and fired a concentrated burst into one of the engines. The bomber dropped away trailing fire while 50 caliber rounds from the top turret stitched across his left wing. His coolant temperature climbed rapidly. Knoke rolled inverted and pushed the stick forward into cloud, using the cover as temporary refuge, while glycol streamed behind him. 11 pilots from his group failed to return from the mission. When he reached base, his fuel and ammunition were almost exhausted, and his aircraft carried numerous bullet strikes. Knoke sat on the grass beside the battered Messerschmitt and stared at the empty spaces where comrades had parked hours earlier. The sky had been full of enemies and empty of friendly fighters. Individual courage remained the means to employ it effectively had vanished. 8th Air Force records show that about 1,000 heavy bombers were dispatched against targets in central Germany on 2 November 1944, including roughly 600 to 700 B-17 aircraft, directed against the Leuna synthetic oil plant, and that well over 600 bombers actually bombed their primary targets through complete cloud cover using H-2X radar. Escort strength totaled about 640 P-51 Mustangs, plus a small number of P-38, Lightnings flying continuous relay escort from the Dutch coast to the target and return. German running commentary tracked the stream from first penetration near Koblenz at 22,000 feet and committed roughly 220 single-engine fighters from Jagdgeschwader, 311-27, 53-76 and 300. Actual engagements involved only 140 German aircraft, because many units aborted shortly after takeoff with engine or boost failures. Heavy flak corridors over Merseburg forced all interceptors into narrow approach lanes, where escort screens waited at 28,000 feet. Luftwaffe pilots claimed 120 bombers and 50 fighters destroyed over central Germany that afternoon. Verified American losses amounted to about 40 heavy bombers and around a dozen fighters for the entire mission. Leuna received well over 1,000 tons of general-purpose and incendiary bombs, and its monthly output fell sharply and remained far below pre-raid capacity for months afterwards. Overclaiming reached 3-to-1 ratio because several pilots often fired at the same stricken bomber, and because burning aircraft frequently fell through lower formations, drawing additional claims. Typical attack pass lasted 12 to 18 seconds at 450 miles per hour, closing speed before escort intervention forced breakaway. Fuel remaining after 30 minutes, maximum power rarely exceeded 100 litres in the Bf 109. First Gruppe Jagdgeschwader 11 suffered the loss of around 10 aircraft and nearly as many pilots in exchanges that lasted less than 8 minutes over the target area. American combat boxes maintained formation integrity despite losing nearly 40 aircraft from the total stream of about 1,000 bombers dispatched that day. 140 German fighters engaged roughly 900 bombers, escorted throughout by about 750 fighters. Luftwaffe Operations Staff Memorandum of 15 November 1944 stated plainly that escorted daylight raids east of the Rhine could no longer be prevented under any weather conditions. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland reported to Goering that increased fighter production delivered nothing without matching fuel and trained pilots. Pre-war doctrine had promised that 300 elite fighters could defend the entire Reich. By late 1944, the entire day fighter arms struggled to place 300 aircraft airborne on any single day. American escort radius reached Berlin itself by March 1944, when long-range P-51 groups flying from English bases with external drop tanks first accompanied the heavy bombers all the way to the German capital. Heinz Knoke recorded in his diary after the Merseburg mission that the sky belonged to the enemy every time the clouds lifted. Post-war interrogation of Galland confirmed that the arrival of P-51 groups in strength during March 1944 decided the daylight campaign within weeks. German synthetic oil production collapsed from about 180,000 tons monthly in early 1944 to around 11,000 tons by January 1945. Authorized fighter pilot establishment remained in the low thousands, while the number of fully combat-ready pilots had fallen to well under half that figure by December. Senior officers conceded privately by December that air superiority over Germany itself had passed permanently to the Allies. The belief that quality could indefinitely substitute for quantity died over the burning refineries of central Germany. Internal documents admitted that each additional 100 long-range American fighters removed another layer of possible defense. Galland later testified that he informed the Reichsmarschall in autumn 1944 that the war in the air was lost. The turning point arrived not with a single dramatic battle, but with the daily sight of escorted bomber streams crossing every river and mountain barrier unhindered. German single-engine fighter units still listed more than 1,000 aircraft on strength across the Reich at the start of 1945, but chronic serviceability problems and fuel shortages meant that only a fraction of them could be sent to intercept on any given day. Operation Bodenplatte, on that morning, consumed around 850 to 900 fighters and fighter bombers in low-level attacks on Allied airfields and cost about 270 fighters destroyed and more than 200 pilots killed or missing for almost no lasting gain. Remaining aviation fuel stocks severely limited large-scale interceptions by February 1945, and many days passed with no fighter response at all to major American raids. Many Gruppen received orders to convert surviving aircraft to ground attack with whatever bombs could be found, while others simply stood down and waited on empty dispersals. By early 1945, The 8th Air Force was capable of dispatching more than 2,000 heavy bombers on single days, and did so on several occasions during the final push into Germany. Synthetic oil plants operated at well under 10% of pre-campaign capacity by March 1945. German armoured divisions on both eastern and western fronts reported 50% vehicle availability, because fuel reached the front in tens of tons instead of thousands. Panzer Lehr Division recorded around 30 operational tanks in early 1945, and by March only about 15 remained. Heinz Knoke survived the war with 33 confirmed aerial victories, and published his memoir in 1953, describing both the fierce tactical combats and the crushing strategic weight that rendered them meaningless. Albert Speer stated in 1947 that the loss of air superiority over German territory itself constituted the decisive turning point of the entire conflict. Historians later calculated that the sustained campaign against oil and transportation targets shortened the war in Europe by 6 to 12 months through cumulative paralysis of movement and production. Former Jagdflieger officers gathered at post-war reunions and spoke quietly of the day they first saw the unbroken contrail roof from horizon to horizon and understood the end had already arrived. Empty runways and silent hangars marked the final defense of the Reich in May 1945. The sky that German pilots had ruled in 1940 now belonged entirely to the enemy, and the ground war beneath it collapsed in weeks rather than years.